families, creating a lifetime of memories. Sadly, some families are denied these important moments due to the sad practice of alienation. These are families divided.
Hello, and welcome to Families Divided. High conflict occurs many times when parents are separated and divorced. In this segment, Dr. Mary Alvarez will share with you some things that will be most helpful to those going through this. Also, Lisa Rothfus will share with us a scenario of how this can happen and what is best to do for the children. We'll be right back in just a minute.
Welcome to Contemporary Family, a global quarterly magazine providing professional resources and
In families dealing with alienation, communication during conflict is often very difficult. This fall, Family Access, Fighting for Children's Rights, will present a special in-person conference to address that very issue. Using and Refining Interpersonal Skills will be held September 9th through the 11th at the Marriott Research Triangle Park in Durham, North Carolina. You'll learn from experts how to master skills that can reduce anxiety, anger, and stress in alienation situations. Join Event Director Elaine Cobb, the founder and president of Family Access Fighting for Children's Rights, and conference moderator Dr. Colleen Murray as they present a lineup of highly respected experts, including keynote speaker Dr. Jeffrey Gardier, plus presentations by Bill Eddy, Megan Hunter, Dr. Joshua Coleman, Dr. Mark Mosk, Dr. Mary Alvarez, Dr. William Burnett, Dr. Sue Kornbluth, Shazia Sparkman, and Lisa Rothfus. Mark your calendar now, September 9th through the 11th, for Using and Refining Interpersonal Skills, hosted by Family Access Fighting for Children's Rights, Steel Partners Foundation, and PASCA. Parental Alienation is Child Abuse. Visit familyaccess.info for more details on the conference and secure your attendance. Seating is limited.
Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk with you about developmental consequences to children in high conflict families. I know that parents are very concerned about their children in many, many ways. However, when high conflict is occurring in a family or parental alienation is part of the equation, often parents lose sight of the child and the consequences to the child in these specific situations. And so I would like to just inform you and help you understand what happens to children so that you can make good decisions about your family and keep the child as the center or the focus of your decisions. So the largest contributor to childhood trauma in our country is family dysfunction. And it accounts for 50% of children who end up in a mental health professional's office for treatment. And it accounts for a third of adults who end up in a mental health professional's office someday. They have backgrounds of abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. And so what happens in families is very relevant for future adjustment for children. So exactly what is family dysfunction? Well, we know that it's when parents argue, they have conflict, they fight. Sometimes there's infidelity. Sometimes there's what we call domestic violence. Sometimes the parents wax and wane, they separate, somebody moves out, then they get back together. And so the child is affected by all of this. The child is affected because sometimes one parent is already priming the child for what we call parental alienation by pulling the child into his or her world and creating an alliance between that parent against the other parent. And so as we move along, you'll see that children don't weather some of these consequences very well. So I'm going to show you a short video. So if you'll sit back for about 2.5 minutes, and if you will watch this video from the perspective of a little boy who has been involved in a high conflict divorce. So listen carefully to his words. So that video was pretty pointed and sobering in a lot of ways because he very easily articulated what it's like to be that child in between two parents and how he ends up feeling as if there's something wrong with him. And so as we continue through, I want to introduce you to what we call adverse childhood experiences. And we now know that parental alienation falls under adverse childhood experiences. So exactly what are these adverse childhood experiences? Well, they contain categories such as abuse, which is physical and sexual, neglect, which can be physical, emotional, and medical, household incidences, separation and divorce is under household, and exposure to things like domestic violence. So the adverse childhood experiences have been studied for many, many years, and we understand them very, very well, and the long-term consequences to children when they have adverse childhood experiences in their early histories. Again, parental alienation is now considered an adverse childhood experience. So what do adverse childhood experiences look like as far as how they march through a child's life? So adverse childhood experiences create what we call the toxic stress response, which is related to developmental trauma, and it contributes to lifelong chronic health conditions, decreased lifespan, increased risky behavior, and increased future mental health diagnoses. And so adverse childhood experiences are very important to understand because this is what can happen to children involved in high conflict divorces and parental alienation families. But aren't children resilient? This is a question that I receive. Can't children weather this? Yes, it may affect them at the time that it's happening, but don't they have the ability to push through and come out the other end relatively unscathed? Well, up to a point. Yes, children do have resiliency, fortunately, up to a point. But there is a point beyond which, pure resiliency is not going to help the child avoid future consequences. However, when children have one parent who is stable and a positive influence in their life, they tend to have increased resiliency. But what happens in these high conflict families? So in the high conflict families and the families that involve parental alienation, the parent who is alienating the child from the other parent looks very calm, cool, and collected. And they speak very well and they talk in ways that are very convincing. However, from an emotional perspective, that parent is not in good shape. And so the child cannot rely on that parent to be that stable force to help them with resiliency. What does the other parent look like in that child's life at the time? Well, the target parent, the parent who is receiving the alienation and is finding a disruption in his or her relationship with the child, isn't in good shape either. That parent feels confused and stressed and doesn't understand necessarily what is happening, but feels something is going very much awry. And so the child ends up not having access to either parent in an emotionally healthy way that promotes resiliency. So again, the child really doesn't have that one stable emotional adult in their lives. And so they are vulnerable then to the effects of these adverse childhood experiences. So let's talk in more detail about toxic stress, because that is one way that we can really see how these children are affected by adult conflict in their lives. Not all stress is bad, though. It's important that you have a little bit of stress when you are put to task for something important, such as a test. If you have a little bit of anxiety about that test, you will perform better than if you have no anxiety at all. Tolerable stress is more than just notable anxiety. It's significant anxiety, but it's temporary. And the event that creates more anxiety is temporary. So the concerning stress is what we call toxic stress. This is a situation in which the stress source is ongoing, that the child does not receive a reprieve from this stress, and their environment never lets up. And so their brain reacts in a way that we call toxic stress because it releases the neurochemicals and the hormones that are related to survival and are very important to us because we need them in situations of danger or crisis, but we're not designed to have an ongoing flow of these neurochemicals and hormones in our brains. When that happens, it results in what we call toxic stress. So what we know is when children are exposed to chronic parent conflict and they don't have a reprieve, the chronic stress response remains in the on position, and their brains continue to receive these neurochemicals as if there is an ongoing, never-ending crisis. And so this creates what we call a priming effect. And what that means is that these children's brains remain in the on position and they're primed for overreactions and high degrees of anxiety for everyday typical life events that happen in most every child's life. So let's talk about this just a little bit more. So the toxic stress creates this priming effect, and I've illustrated this in the following graph. The bottom cylinder is the unprimed brain. It is the brain of a child who does not exist in a high conflict family. And you can see that the resting stress level is fairly low. So when something happens to a child that's very common, such as their pet dies, they weren't invited to a sleepover, their best friend moved away, they have quite a bit of room in their brain to have a normal reaction to it. And they don't have an excessively overreaction as what is happening in the primed brain, the upper cylinder on the graph in front of you. So this is the brain of a child who is involved in a high conflict family, who has a never ending stress response because the environment is just never ending in conflict. And so you can see by the blue part of that cylinder that this child's brain is already primed with a high degree of stress. And so when a normal childhood experience happens, again, such as their best friend moves away or one of their pets dies, they are already at a very high level. And so when something happens, their brains push even further into the stress response, and they have much anxiety, much angst, and oftentimes a very significant overreaction given what has just happened in their world. The childhood trauma also affects what we know as the serotonin and the oxytocin systems in our brain. Serotonin is related to mood regulation. It's important for all of us to have normal amounts of serotonin to help us feel and regulate our mood. Toxic stress reduces serotonin. And when we have reduced serotonin, we know that we are prone to depression, anxiety. Some people act out aggressively, and in extreme situations, it is related to borderline personality disorder. The oxytocin system is related to interpersonal relationships. It is the hormone that helps us connect, helps us attach. It's very, very important. And it also is affected by toxic stress. And we found that in adults who have histories of high conflict families and abuse and neglect, that they still have reduced rates of oxytocin in their system. And so my point is, what happens in a child's life is very important to their future adjustment and their future psychological health. And so considering all of this in the context of your own high conflict or your own situation of parental alienation is why I'm here today to talk to you about what is happening so that you can make good decisions for your child. Some of the psychological and neurological consequences that happen to these children are as follows. The psychological disorders that we find in higher frequencies from children who come from high conflict and parental alienation families are increased PTSD, which is the extreme anxiety, depression, anxiety overall, antisocial behavior, and that these children are at greater risk for addictions as they try and use alcohol or drugs to self-medicate their internal feelings that have been disrupted. The neuropsychological deficits on the right side of your screen include lots of processing areas such as memory and executive functions and visual spatial areas. IQ and achievement are often not reached in these children because of the effect of toxic stress. And the bottom three, you will see, are actual anatomical changes in the brain. They're not just processing changes or psychological disorders on the left side, but they are changes to the structures of the brain. And they include the frontal lobe, the white matter in the frontal lobe, and the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of fibers that connects your right and left hemispheres and helps your brain process information back and forth. Well, if you have all of these anatomical changes in your brain, again, life is more difficult and you are less likely to achieve your God-given potential. So what can happen to children in a high conflict family additionally to what I've already discussed with you? Well, we know that these are some additional consequences to these children. 65% of children have anxiety significant enough that they need counseling, they need mental health intervention. 56% of them have developed an attachment disorder because alienation creates a non-biological way for children to have to interact with a parent that is not hardwired into their system, and rejecting a parent is not normal, not natural. And so that attachment is disrupted for these children. 44% of them act out with aggression. That's the way that they manage this high conflict. Half of these children have abnormal fears and phobias, based on the conflict, and that's their response. And a third of these children have sleep difficulties, which is important to consider because lack of sleep and lack of enough sleep is related to school performance and school functioning. And so these children struggle additionally, not just with the conflict, but they're tired and they're not receiving quality sleep, or at least a third of them aren't. So if we look more specifically at parental alienation, all right, we understand that a child's internal self, or what we call their psyche, is comprised of a mom and a dad. That's just the way that we're all wired. We all were like this as children. I know that you might not necessarily remember it this way, but this is the natural way that children are put together, half mom and half dad. And so attempting to erase one parent, attempting to remove a parent from the child's life goes against what is natural for a child. And it creates this sense that whatever is so wrong with the other parent, what the child hears continually about the other parent that is negative, the child begins to internalize that must be wrong with me too.
Families Divided will return in a moment.
This is a story about David. He's been divorced for about a year and he has two sons, ages 8 and 10. He has an expanded standard visitation and he goes to pick them up every Thursday to have an overnight at his house. But in the last few weeks, the boys have not been wanting to get out of the car or go with him. He suspects it's probably something his ex-wife is saying to them, but he's not sure. However, he is getting more and more angry and frustrated with the situation. This scene takes place in an H-E-B parking lot on a Thursday night when they're doing their exchange for the overnight. Lately, when he's been arriving at H-E-B to pick the boys up, they have not been wanting to get out of the car and go with him. This night, he shows up, and now they don't want to get out of the car at all. As he walks towards the car, he hears his son say, "We don't want to go with you. We don't want to stay overnight. We want to stay with Mom." He can feel himself getting angry and tense. He goes up to his wife's car and says, "Tell the boys to get out of the car and go with me." They can all see how angry he is. So the mom turns around and she says to them, "Boys, you have to get out of the car. This is your dad's time. You know you have to go with him." But the boys don't budge. "We don't want to go with him. We don't want to do an overnight." Now David's getting increasingly angry. So he walks up to the window where the boys are and he says, "Stop being such babies. Get out of that car. You can stand to be away from your mother for one night. And if you don't get out of that car, I'm going to come over there and open up the door and I'm going to make you get out of that car." David really messed that up. He let the anger get the best of him, and everything he did made the situation worse between him and his boys. Let's talk about what he did wrong and what he could do better. David has a particular type of parenting style called authoritarian parenting. When he was married and his children were younger, he was able to get away with that style of parenting. But now he's divorced, and he and his wife are not making decisions together anymore. And his children are getting older. And this kind of parenting is actually starting to hurt David's relationships with his boys. In this particular scene, David is extremely angry, and he really lets the anger get the best of him. When he approaches the car, he not only shows how angry he is, he also yells, threatens the boys, and calls them names, all of which make the situation at the car much worse. So let's talk about how this scene could have gone very differently. David knew he was struggling with anger. It probably would have been good if he'd reached out and gotten a little help with that. What he doesn't seem to understand is that now, when he's trying to work on a relationship with his boys, he needs to be more patient and more understanding than he's ever been before in his life. That pushing them and demanding that they be respectful of him is actually pushing the boys away from him. One thing David could have done that would have been helpful was to talk to his ex-wife ahead of time and agree that if the boys were having a hard time, they would just go together somewhere for a little while and let the boys sort of transition and get used to being with David again. Sometimes it's really hard for children to transition from one parent to the other, and they need a time to adjust. They also could have spent some time talking together about, well, what could they do to help the boys feel more comfortable? And David could have really tried to listen to what they were saying. So let's go back and redo that scene with David and see what he could have done differently. So David walks up to the car and he hears the boys say, "We don't want to go with you. We want to stay with Mom. We don't want to do overnights with you anymore." And he says, "Well, I hear what you're saying and I can see that you're upset, but I think we should all go somewhere and we should all talk about it together. So your mom and I have agreed we'll just go somewhere and we'll sit together for a while and we'll talk about what you're so upset about. But we don't want to go." So Sally turns to the boys and says, "We're going to all go somewhere together and we're going to sit and we're going to talk about what you're upset about." And they all agree to go and have dinner together. These kinds of situations are really hard, and there isn't any magic for making them come out just right. Sometimes you really do need to reach out to somebody to help you problem solve and think about how you can create a better situation with your child.
Family Access, Fighting for Children's Rights, has 2 important email addresses you can use to reach us to request prayers for your family or to suggest a subject matter you would like to see covered on the Families Divided TV program. To request prayer for your family, please email us at prayersforfamilies@gmail.com. Is there a subject you would like covered on Families Divided? If so, then send your email to requestsforfamiliesdividedtv@gmail.com. We are here to help you in your journey.
Join us next week on Families Divided when Dr. Colleen Murray interviews Dr. Carol Golly on the psychology of the alienated child.